Audit documentation. Purposes of audit documentation. ISA 230. Audit documentation requires auditors to prepare and retain written documentation that provides evidence of the auditor's basis for their report, provides evidence that the audit was planned and performed in accordance with ISAs and applicable legal and regulatory requirements. Form and content of audit documentation. Documentation should be sufficient to enable an experienced auditor with no previous connection to the audit to understand the nature, timing, and extent of audit procedures performed, the results of the procedures performed, and the evidence obtained, the significant matters arising during the course of the audit, and the conclusions reached thereon, and significant professional judgments made in reaching those conclusions. Retention of working papers. Documentation is retained in an audit file, which should be completed in a timely fashion after the date of the auditor's report, normally not more than 60 days after, and retained for the period required by national regulatory requirements. This is normally 5 years from the date of the auditor's report. Types of audit documentation. Audit documentation includes planning documentation, overall audit strategy, audit plan, audit programs, summary of significant matters, written representation from management, checklists, correspondence, copies of client records, planning. The main element of this section is likely to be the audit planning memorandum. This document is the written audit plan and will be read by all members of the audit team before work starts. Its contents are likely to include background information about the client, including recent performance, changes since last year's audit for recurring clients, key accounting policies, important laws and regulations affecting the company, trial balance or draft financial statements, preliminary analytical procedures, key audit risks, overall audit strategy, materiality assessment, timetable of procedures, deadlines, staffing and a budget, hours to be worked multiplied by charge-out rates, locations to be visited, performance. Working papers are likely to consist of lead schedule, showing total figures which agree to the financial statements, backup schedules, breakdowns of totals into relevant subtotals, audit work program detailing, the objectives being tested, work completed, how samples were selected, conclusions drawn, who did the work, date the work was completed, by whom it was reviewed, completion, The completion, also known as review, stage of an audit has a number of standard components. Going concern review, subsequent events review, final analytical procedures, accounting standards, disclosure checklist, written representation from management, summary of adjustments made since trial balance produced. Summary of unadjusted misstatements, draft final financial statements, draft report to those charged with governance, and management letter. Security of working papers. Who owns the working papers? The auditor owns the audit working papers. This is important because access to the working papers is controlled by the auditor, not the client, which is an element in preserving the auditor's independence. In some circumstances, care may need to be taken when copies of client-generated schedules are incorporated into the file. Security working papers must be kept secure. By its nature, audit evidence will comprise confidential, sensitive information. If the files are lost or stolen, the auditor's duty of confidentiality will be compromised. Audits are expensive. If the files are lost or stolen, the evidence they contain will need to be recreated, so the work will need to be done again. The auditors may be able to recover the costs from their insurers, but otherwise it will simply represent a loss to the firm. There have been cases of unscrupulous clients altering auditors' working papers to conceal frauds. The implications of IT-based audit systems are also far-reaching. By their nature, laptops are susceptible to theft, even though the thief may have no interest in the contents of the audit file. Nevertheless, all the problems associated with re-performing the audit and breaches of confidentiality remain. It is more difficult to be certain who created or amended computer-based files than manual files. Handwriting, signatures, and dates have their uses, and this makes it harder to detect whether the files have been tampered with. This means that the following precautions need to be taken. If files are left unattended at client's premises, overnight or during lunch breaks, they should be securely locked away, or if this is not possible, taken home by the audit team. When files are left in a car, the same precautions should be taken as with any valuables. IT-based systems should be subject to passwords, encryption, and backup procedures.